This is a horse. I'm sorry, Jasmine, but this nonsense has to stop.
The noble and majestic horse, the subject of human artwork and culture for thousands of years, at least in the Old World. While horses existed in the Americas until around 10,000 years ago, they became extinct, and remained so until the arrival of Christopher Columbus's herd in 1493. This potentially creates a problem for the historicity of the Book of Mormon, a problem that apologists for the church want to fix with the help of an unlikely odd-toed ungulate from Central and South America.
I'm here with the Brazilian tapir, the largest of the 3 species native to the Americas. And if you believe what Dan Peterson's saying, then this thing will go to war for you.
Okay, so I don't think Dan Peterson has ever said that directly, but he is a proponent of the lone shift theory, which, taken to its logical conclusion, means that the horses of the Book of Mormon that pull chariots and go to war are in fact tapirs. I'll let Jasmine Rapley explain.
This is a horse. Doesn't look like a horse, doesn't function like a horse, not really genetically related to horses. But the word hippo literally means horse. Because when ancient Greeks encountered this exotic animal, they didn't know what to call it, so they called it a hippopotamus, which translates to river horse. It's got 4 legs, it's big, lives in a river horse. When indigenous American populations encountered the Spanish for the first time riding on these large 4-legged creatures, their records referred to them as deer because they didn't have another word for it. And yes, they sometimes even referred to the Spanish horses as tapirs. This is called a lone shift in anthropology, when a population applies a familiar word in their language to an unfamiliar animal or concept. It's not mental gymnastics. This is a well-known and documented phenomenon when populations migrate and come in contact with each other. So when the Book of Mormon talks about horses, even though many scholars believe that horses did not exist in the Americas at this time, one reasonable possibility among several is that when the Nephites from the Old World encountered an unfamiliar species in the New World, such as a deer or yes, even a tapir, they could have applied their familiar word horse to the unfamiliar animal they encountered.
We're going to ignore for just a moment the fact that the tapir equals horse argument only works if you adopt a hemispheric or continental model for the Book of Mormon's geography, which in itself is problematic and should probably be the subject of another video. Instead, we're going to focus on dismantling the notion that these adorable and ancient mammals could be the same creatures described as horses in the Book of Mormon. And Jasmine didn't start this. Though building on the work of John L. Sorensen, the tapir debacle all started in earnest with Daniel Peterson, who said the following.
The suggestion that a tapir is referred to in the Book of Mormon by the word horse has been met with a lot of ridicule from a lot of people who, it strikes me, are actually fairly ignorant of anthropology and linguistics. It's very common for a group that moves into a new area, when they see a strange animal, to give it the name of an animal that's more familiar to them. I'll give you some examples. When the Romans first encountered elephants, they called them Lucabos, Lucanian cows, because for some reason they reminded Romans of cows. Now, an elephant obviously isn't a cow. When the Greeks went into Egypt, they encountered a really strange animal that they called a hippopotamus. What does a hippopotamus mean? It means a river horse. Hippopotami are not horses, but the Greeks called them horses. And still in German, the word for a hippopotamus is a Nilpferd, a Nile horse. So you look around and you see this very, very commonly. It's so common as to be uncontroversial. Seahorses are not horses. Prairie dogs are not dogs. Groundhogs are not hogs. This happens all the time. People see an animal, it reminds them of an animal they already knew, and they give it that animal's name. When the American Indians first encountered conquistador horses, they called them deer.
Playing devil's advocate for Dan Peterson, it isn't particularly problematic in and of itself to postulate that the Nephites, upon discovering the unfamiliar tapir, decided to call it a horse because it reminded them of the horses of their native Arabian Peninsula, which they neglected to bring with them on the sea voyage. That's leaving Curoloms and Cumoms at the door, of course, because they had no trouble finding a new and novel name for whatever on earth those things were. And that's also ignoring the fact that most of the examples that Daniel Peterson puts forth come with a modifier.
Lucanian cows, the river horse, seahorses, prairie dogs, groundhogs.
I would argue this is more common than the one example he and Jasmine gave of a deer.
When the American Indians first encountered conquistador horses, they called them deer.
Putting those things to one side, if horses in the Book of Mormon are indeed tapirs, then we still have to confront the role they play in the Book of Mormon's narrative.
And that's the crux of the issue. If you believe what Dan Peterson and others are espousing, well then, this is what you get. Everything described in the Book of Mormon as being done by horses is being done by one of these things. Hello. So what exactly does the Book of Mormon say about these horses?
Here is every verse containing the word horse from the Book of Mormon. First, we have to discount any examples which are simply quotes from the Bible discussing horses in locations outside the Americas. That leaves us still with 10 examples of horses in pre-Columbian America. So let's get into those. This verse describes the animals the Nephites found when they landed in America, among which are horses. Also, for some reason, goats are split into goats and wild goats. But I'm not sure quite who could have domesticated one of the groups of goats, but not the other. Let me know in the comments if you know why that could be. The next verse describes horses as being domesticated by the Nephites, being raised in flocks of herds. But it's Alma where the horses of the Book of Mormon begin to be firmly associated with transport, with both verse 9 and verse 10 of Alma 18 describing horses and chariots together, with no commas to separate them, in preparation for a journey by King Lamoni. Ammon, a servant of King Lamoni whose faithfulness was the subject of the previous verses, again is discussed in this verse as having made the king's horses and chariots ready for the king and his servants to make the journey to the land of Nephi. A couple of chapters later, when Ammon, who by this point has gone from humble servant to best chums with King Lamoni, needs to go to the land of Middoni to save his brothers, the king again orders his horses and chariots to be made ready for the journey. The warfare element comes into play as we move into 3rd Nephi, which states, "They had taken their horses and their chariots and their cattle and all their flocks and their herds and their grain and all their substance, and did march forth by thousands and by tens of thousands, until they had all gone forth to the place which had been appointed that they should gather themselves together to defend themselves against their enemies." They took horses and chariots to defend themselves against their enemy. If that isn't warfare, well, I'm not sure what else to call it. These last few verses mention horses as a form of livestock, along with cattle, and 3rd Nephi 6:1 seems to indicate too that each man had individual horses and cattle. Finally, jumping back in time because of the way the Book of Mormon's narrative is written, we go back to the Jaredites, who talk again not only about horses, but the famous Curiloms and Cumoms. Again, it is an interesting question as to why these brand new nouns for these unknown animals were used, but horses was chosen with no modifier to describe tapirs, despite actual horses being present in the text. Because on that point, do you remember the verses we discounted because they were quoting the Old Testament and talking about actual horses in the Old World? Well, these create a unique problem all of their own, that being textual consistency.
The Book of Mormon was written for us today.
If it was truly written for us in our day, then the specific audience for this text is one that would have a clear understanding of what a horse is. And yet no differentiation is made in the text between the concept of a horse in these Old Testament verses and some different animal by the exact same name as first spotted by the Nephites in 1 Nephi 18:25. The second and third mentions of horses are quotes from Isaiah in 2 Nephi, traditional Old World horses. Then we have horses spoken about again in the New World in Enos, without any qualifiers or modifiers to indicate that they are in any way different to the horses just mentioned in the Isaiah quotations. Somehow, we are meant to know that sometimes horses are tapirs and sometimes they are actual Old World horses. And let's not forget, the horses in the Book of Mormon are described as performing tasks that are normally undertaken by horses as we understand them and would never be undertaken by a tapir. Don't believe me that a tapir wouldn't pull a chariot or go to war or carry things for people? I asked someone who spends a lot of time with a tapir what they think about this.
So what's the day-to-day routine of a tapir like? When are they most active and that sort of thing?
They are generally more crepuscular or nocturnal animals, so dawn and dusk, and then during the night as well. They'll spend most of the day sleeping. They'll sort of make themselves a little hide in the undergrowth, so really dense, thick vegetation is where they're sleeping throughout the day. It's because it's obviously hottest in the day as well, so it's a little bit more comfortable at night, and predator-wise as well. They're going to avoid a lot of things during the day. They don't have a huge amount of predators in the wild. Things like your jaguars and your pumas, the cats are going to be big predators, and also humans is quite high up on the list. They're hunted regularly for their meat and their hides.
What is their relationship to humans sort of in their natural environment?
A lot of the range that they're found in is sort of fragmented. Road networks are a huge problem for tapirs. So lots of species adapt to people in lots of different ways. So lots of species see people as a resource, but tapirs are quite elusive. They're quite suspicious animals in nature. So they do tend to avoid people where they can, but roadkill is a big issue for tapirs because the road networks that are breaking up that habitat. But generally they're not going to be wandering down into a village unless they've absolutely got a reason to.
How old is the species? Would that have changed over time? Or
They are considered a living fossil. We've got fossil records dating back to, we think, about 50 million years, which means they've survived waves of extinctions of other animals. And they've changed very, very little in that time as well. What we do have puts them being quite similar to the way that they are now. So they're very, very long-lived.
And so, given that they're naturally very sort of suspicious, have they ever been sort of domesticated or made useful to people?
Domestication of animals depends on lots of different factors. Things like reproductive rate. Domestication is going to favour animals that reproduce quickly and have quite low mortality rates. Tapirs, a female's probably going to get pregnant once every 3 years, so not very often. Gestation lasts well over a year, usually about 13, 14 months. And after that, you've only got one calf. So that's not ideal for domestication. Things like behavioural traits, again, domestication favours animals that are pretty confident, pretty amenable. That's not tapirs at all. They're quite elusive, they're quite sort of, not sort of docile, but they're not particularly amenable. If you ask her to get out of bed, it's probably not going to happen. Domestication is going to favour things that can live in groups, things that are adaptable to people. Again, that's not tapirs. Tapirs are a pretty solitary animal. They don't do well in groups.
They wouldn't be used by people to carry things in that sense.
They've got pretty impressive strength behind them. It would be pretty difficult to encourage one to do what you wanted, unless you had some pretty impressive means of persuasion.
Right, okay. And so then could you get one to pull a chariot?
I'm sure you could try, but I don't think you'd be very successful. I think if a tapir had a middle finger, you'd probably see it.
Could you ride one?
I don't think you could ride one. I think a small child could probably sit on one and be thrown straight off, but no, I don't think riding one is going to happen.
Right, so they couldn't really pull a chariot, couldn't really ride one. Is there any way in which you could use a tapir to wage war with someone?
I'm no expert in warfare, but I would not say that that's very likely. I think it's very improbable, yeah.
What is your favourite fact about the tapir?
I think my favourite fact is how long-lived they've been. So to survive waves and waves of extinction of other animals over tens of millions of years and change very little in that time is a pretty impressive feat.
As our tapir keeper pointed out, tapirs are sometimes referred to as a living fossil, and when it comes to actual fossils, that is the only kind of horse that you would have found in the Americas during the proposed timeline of the Book of Mormon. This here, for example, is a wild horse molar that was found in Florida, and it's 1.5 million years old. And before you come at me with any absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, the whole reason for this tapir lone shift argument by apologists is because they themselves accept the lack of horses during the timeline of the Book of Mormon. If archaeological evidence of horses in North America during the timeline of the Book of Mormon should come to light, I promise I will be here and ready to discuss it. And I'm sure apologists will immediately abandon the lone shift argument in favour of this archaeological evidence, because it's just stronger. But really, apologists would just be better off waiting for the archaeology to support their position, rather than espousing these laughable theories about lone shifting and tapirs. Theories which, by the way, are not supported by the church nor its leaders who claim to speak for God.
Do you know what the word prophet means? He speaks for God.
Those leaders could easily clarify this issue for us, and indeed you could say the official church line has been to make clear through artwork that they believe it was really horses as we understand them today in the Book of Mormon. It was the same leaders who claimed divine inspiration and guidance who approved artworks such as this, and this one specifically aimed at children. Tapirs either should be officially added into the church artwork and put in the footnotes of the scriptures, or we can just accept that this tapir hypothesis is the philosophies of men mingled with scripture and we can be on our way. Either way, what tapirs really need, rather than being dragged into frankly silly religious apologetics, is our support, as all 4 extant species are currently vulnerable in one way or another. What is the biggest threat to tapirs today? If they're not going into war, they're not, taking arrows for their country, what is the biggest threat to them today?
There's quite a few things. There's 4 species of tapir today. All of them are endangered in one way or another. If we're looking at the tapirs in South America, it's predominantly habitat loss lots and lots of habitats, things like the Atlantic forest. They're existing in about 2% of their original range. Fragmentation of habitats as well, so putting a road down the middle of the forest, breaking up groups. It puts them into smaller groups, and because of their reproductive rate, if you haven't got enough reproducing at the same time, you're going to have more deaths than you are births. And they are also hunted in quite a lot of the range for meat, and a huge killer of tapirs in the wild, which sort of relates to the fragmentation of the habitat, is roadkill. They are hit as they're crossing roads to try and get from one patch to another. There's a huge death rate of roadkill.
Okay, so what can we do to try and stop tapirs being endangered?
There's lots of things you can do. We're all busy, we can't all go to South America and guide them across the roads. There are lots and lots of conservation efforts going on. There are reintroduction programs. We are putting things back in the wild in lots of different places. So you can always support those. They're all run by donations predominantly, so there's lots of things that people can do to kind of help the cause.
On that note, a huge thank you to the team at Tropiquaria Zoo in Somerset for letting me come and film with Indra the tapir. All ad revenue from this video will be donated directly to the zoo, to help keep Indra well fed with plenty of branches and leaves. To maximise the money they get, please like this video and share it with anyone who may find it interesting. Also, to ensure the algorithm knows that you love horses, tapirs, make sure to watch this video here about how the humbled tapir became the symbol of the ex-Mormon community and whether it actually constitutes a hate symbol.